you have two countries here who both think they're facing an existential threat from the other. Figuring out a compromise between those two sides is difficult in the extreme. Ukraine is in a demographic death spiral. You're talking about continuing this war, more Ukrainians dying, losing more territory. Cut a deal now.
This, let me tell you, is a winnable, or at least a war in Ukraine where we can secure a sovereign Ukraine. This is where Mearsheimer is wrong again. To the extent that Russia feels that it has one, it will seek to bank what it has and take more. Moreover, it will send a signal to other tyrants. I've mentioned China already, which has its eyes on Taiwan. Escalation is more likely when you show weakness.
Hello and welcome back to UnHerd. For the past week or more, there has been wall-to-wall coverage on all of the news channels of the peace talks for Ukraine. But is it just theatre? Through all of the TV, all of the commentary on outfits and funny remarks and all the rest of it, is there actually a space in between the two positions that still today feel unbridgeably far apart? Today we're going to do a special deep dive trying to understand really what those two positions are and whether there is room for any kind of compromise. There's an underlying practical and philosophical gap. Should Ukraine accept territorial losses to get to a position where there is no longer a war? That is the most important and hardest question of all, and lots of good, thoughtful people disagree about it. In one camp, you have the self-described realists. They tend to emphasize Russian self-interest, the strength of the Russians, and how the West really should accept some of their claims and just do a deal to stop the slaughter. In the other camp, you have, let's call them the idealists, who feel like any surrender to this blatant warmongering, this blatant aggression, would be a signal to the world and would lead to chaos. They emphasize that Russia is weaker than it appears and must be defeated at all costs. Today, we're going to talk to two people in sequence, both of whom speak very eloquently and brilliantly for their positions. John Mearsheimer, professor at Chicago University, is perhaps the most famous realist of them all. We're going to talk to him first and understand where he stands on these peace negotiations. Then we're going to talk to Matthew Syed, a brilliant writer, a thinker, and someone who, in his most recent column in the Sunday Times, actually name-checked John Mearsheimer as someone who he considers to be, quote, morally deranged. So there's a huge distance between them. We're not having a live debate where they are going at each other, which may disappoint some of you, but actually I think this way of doing it, where we can really explore their different positions and let you judge at the end of it who you feel more aligned with, works pretty well. So first up, we are joined by Professor Mearsheimer, down the line from Chicago. Welcome to UnHerd, Professor.
I'm glad to be here, as always, Freddie.
So I have to start with the million-dollar question. Do you think there is any hope that a lasting peace settlement comes out of this whole extended period of diplomacy?
No, I think there's virtually no chance of that. I think when you look at what Russia's main demands are, which are largely non-negotiable, and you look at the Ukrainian and European position on the future of the war and what's necessary to put an end to it, it's hard to see how you could possibly reconcile the two sets of demands. They're just irreconcilable. The Europeans and the Ukrainians on one side and the Russians on the other side are miles apart. And I think there's no way you can work out a deal.
What do you understand the Russian demands to be?
I think there are three main Russian demands. I think the first is that the West recognize that the 4 oblasts that the Russians have annexed, plus Crimea, belong to Russia. That's the territorial demand. The second demand...
Just sorry to interrupt, Professor, but on that first one, my understanding was they were asking for the whole Donbass, which consists of Donetsk and Luhansk, and not necessarily requiring the other 2 oblasts, but you understand differently.
We don't know what the Russian position is because they haven't told us. The argument that the Europeans are making is that Trump told them, or somebody in the Trump camp told them, that the Russians would be willing to accept a ceasefire if the Ukrainians withdrew from those two Donbass oblasts and froze the conflict line in Zaporizhia and Kherson, the other two oblasts. But that's just a ceasefire. That's not the final deal. And furthermore, the Russians would really be smart to accept that ceasefire, and the Ukrainians would be foolish to accept it, because the end result of that deal that's being talked about is that Ukraine would give up the Donbass. And the Russians have had enormous difficulty conquering the Donbass. And here you would have a situation where Ukraine would give it up, freeze the conflict lines in the other two oblasts, all for what? For a ceasefire? And then when the ceasefire broke down, the Russians would already control Donbass, and they'd be in an excellent position to move forward in Kherson and Zaporizhia. So that deal's not a good deal.
That's the territorial issue, and I guess we'll come back to that. What are the other demands as you understand them?
Second demand is that Ukraine has to be neutral, and that means that Ukraine cannot be in NATO and that the West cannot give security guarantees to Ukraine. And of course, on that issue, there's all sorts of talk now that Putin is willing to allow the West, including the United States, to give security guarantees to Ukraine. I don't believe that for one second. To the extent that he would be willing to give security guarantees, those security guarantees would look like the ones that they were talking about at Istanbul in March and April of 2022. And the Russians would be involved in those security guarantees, and the Russians would have a veto over those security guarantees.
Right. Well, that's not much of a security guarantee from the Ukrainians' point of view, is it?
Yeah. I mean, as you know, Freddie, I've long argued that this war is mainly about Ukraine and NATO. From the Russian point of view, I know many people in the West don't accept this, but from the Russian point of view, Ukraine and NATO is an existential threat. And having security guarantees from, number one, the United States, and two, the Europeans, which form this coalition of the willing, is effectively the same as having a security guarantee from NATO, having an Article 5 guarantee. And that's just unacceptable to the Russians. So I don't think that they're going to cave on that point. And then the third demand, of course, has to do with disarming to a large extent the Ukrainian military, at least to a point where Ukraine does not have or does not present an offensive military threat to Russia. That's the third big demand. And I think those demands are non-negotiable. If you go over to the other side, you go over to where the West is, and here we're talking mainly about the Ukrainians and the Europeans, no territory for Russia, security guarantees for Ukraine, and indeed the coalition of the willing, and here we're talking mainly about Starmer and Macron, have issued a statement where they say that they want to station tens of thousands of European troops in Ukraine after you have a peace agreement. Hard for me to imagine the Russians accepting Ukraine having a legitimate security guarantee and also allowing European troops on Ukrainian soil.
When you put it like that, Professor, there's not just one problem with a potential peace deal. I mean, on all of those three key points, there is just miles of distance between the two sides. It does seem unthinkable how they're going to bridge that in the coming days or weeks.
That's my view, Freddie. I don't see any story that anyone can tell on how you get the two sides to come to some sort of meaningful agreement on those key issues. They're just miles apart. And I think the Trump administration understands this.
Let's just try to get there for a moment. So first of all, isn't the fact that these peace negotiations or discussions has even happened a positive sign? I mean, President Putin came to American soil. They had the discussions there. Not a lot happened, and there wasn't very much by way of material consequence, but it showed a willingness to have a conversation. Could you make the case, perhaps, that actually behind the scenes, Russia is becoming more and more keen on some kind of deal? We know that the economy is struggling. You might bat away that idea, but interest rates are very high. Local regional banks are struggling. There is a sense that they can't just continue ad infinitum like this. President Trump has threatened expanded sanctions to intermediaries who buy their oil and the rest of it. It would be a good thing for President Putin to get a deal out of this and turn the page, don't you think?
Let me make two sets of points. The first is that there are four players in the game. There are the Russians, the Americans, and then there are the Europeans, who've become quite a force recently, and the Ukrainians. I think that what you had in Alaska were two of the players, the Americans and the Russians, coming together. And I think that even if the Americans and the Russians could reach a deal, that it would be impossible for the Americans to get the Europeans and the Ukrainians to buy onto that deal. There's no question that Trump would like to cut a deal with the Russians. And I think that Trump, by and large, would be willing to concede to most of Russia's demands. But even if he does that, right, even if he does that, the Europeans are not going to accept it and the Ukrainians are not going to accept it. And you can't put an end to this war unless all four players in the game agree. That's point one. Point two is, I think there's no question that from an economic point of view, the Russians have a vested interest in putting an end to this war. I don't think they're hurting quite as badly as you make it out to be. But more important than the economy is what's happening on the battlefield. And by virtually all accounts, the Ukrainians are in deep trouble. And this includes the mainstream media in Europe and the United States. Almost everybody recognizes that the Ukrainians have a manpower problem. They don't have enough infantrymen to thickly populate the front lines. And their front lines, the Ukrainian front lines, are remarkably porous, and this leaves them open to Russian penetrations. And there is no hope of fixing this situation anytime soon. And at the same time, there's all sorts of evidence that public support for the war inside of Ukraine is beginning to evaporate in serious ways. So it looks like the Russians have the advantage on the battlefield. And if you have the advantage on the battlefield, you have no interest in a ceasefire. I mean, this, of course, is why the Russians constantly say they will not agree to a ceasefire. And furthermore, in terms of working a peace deal out, they're going to want a peace deal on their terms because they're winning on the battlefield. And of course, the Ukrainians and the Europeans are not going to agree to that. And Trump is not going to agree to that. And the end result is the war is going to go on.
When we first had a conversation, I think around about 2 years ago, you were talking about Russians advancing beyond even the four oblasts they have partially conquered to date into the next four oblasts, which would include Odessa, Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk, and Mykolaiv. Do you still think that is possible? I mean, it's quite remarkable that that really hasn't happened. I mean, the front line as it was around about 2 years ago is, if you look on a large scale map, hasn't changed very much. There have been incremental advances over that period. Despite everything you're saying, despite the difficulties Ukraine's had with recruitment and rearming and all the rest of it, could you not make the case that those people who were really worried about big Russian advances, and maybe you were one of them 2 years ago, have been proven wrong, and that actually Russia's had a surprisingly difficult time making big territorial advances?
Well, the key point is that from the beginning, this has been a war of attrition. And in a war of attrition, what really matters is the casualty exchange ratio. It's not taking territory. If you think about World War I from 1914 to 1918, the battle lines hardly changed at all. And both sides stood toe to toe and pounded each other until they each were bleeding white. And then the only interesting question is which side collapses, which then allows the winning side to move forward and capture more territory. So it's not surprising that given that this has been a war of attrition, and that the West has provided with the Ukrainians with so much material capability that the Russians have not ended up conquering much territory. What is expected to happen is that at some point the Ukrainian military will collapse, that it won't be able to hold on. This is what the discussion about the lack of infantry is all about. And at that point, the Russians will be in a position to move forward. Now, is it possible that that will never happen? Yes. But I think it is likely that that will happen. The front lines will begin to crumble and the Russians will begin to move forward. But you don't want to talk about the territorial situation today as if that is where we're going to end up, period, end of story. This is a very fluid conflict, and it could be the case, and I think it will be the case, that the Ukrainians will end up losing substantially more territory.
So do you think all of these discussions are a waste of time? Or do you think something is achieved by at least going through the motions?
They're a waste of time in the sense I don't think you're going to get a meaningful ceasefire. They're a waste of time in the sense that I don't think you're going to get a peace agreement. I think the war, as I've long argued, is going to be settled on the battlefield. And in that sense, it's a waste of time. I think from the American point of view, it's creating a situation that's going to allow Trump to divorce the United States to some extent from Europe and Ukraine and put the ball in their court. I think what Trump has tried to do up to now is Trump has tried to get the United States to work with the Russians to shut this conflict down, to get a meaningful peace agreement. He failed. I think what will happen is that Trump will go to some lengths to try to push responsibility for the war into the arms of the Europeans and the Ukrainians and move the United States away from managing the conflict. You can already see that happening with regard to the flow of arms to Ukraine. Trump is smart enough to know that he doesn't want to just cut the Ukrainians off cold turkey because Trump understands that Ukraine is going to lose and he does not want to be blamed. So he has a vested interest in making sure that American arms continue to flow to Ukraine. But he doesn't want to look like Joe Biden. He doesn't want to look like he's just keeping the Biden pipeline open. So he's created this very clever situation where the Europeans buy the arms from the United States and the Europeans give the arms directly to the Ukrainians. So American weaponry will continue to go to the Ukrainians as it did with the Biden pipeline. It's just that it will not go directly. The Europeans will serve as a conduit, and the Europeans will pay for it. Furthermore, I think what Trump will do is he will tell the Europeans, and you can already see lots of evidence of this, that it's the Europeans, and especially the Ukrainians, who have to negotiate with Putin. If they want him, Donald Trump, to come in and serve as a moderator in these discussions, he's more than willing to do it. But he's not going to meet with Putin and try and shut this one down and then try and get the Ukrainians and the Europeans on board because the Europeans and Ukrainians are not on board. And therefore, it makes no sense for Trump to try to convince the Europeans and the Ukrainians to get on board. They're just adamantly opposed.
Do you think there is enough either willpower or economic or military industrial strength within Europe to continue to repel Russia, or at least keep the lines as they are at the moment? Or do you think if the US gradually steps back, the Russians will be making more advances?
Well, for the foreseeable future, Freddie, I'd say the willpower is there. I'm quite amazed at how deeply committed the Europeans are, the British, the French, the Germans, how deeply committed they are to Ukraine's defense and to Ukraine's position. Ukraine and Europe are really tight at this point in time. With regard to the weaponry, as I said, the American weaponry is going to continue to flow to Ukraine. It's just going to go through Europe, and European weaponry is going to continue to flow. So there's not going to be a cutoff in material aid. The Europeans remain fully committed. It's just the Americans who are going to step back and turn more of the burden of managing the war and dealing with Putin and the Russians over to the Europeans and to Ukraine.
One thing the Europeans are good at is clever language to fudge an issue and to kick things into the long grass. So it feels like that's a sort of European Union special subject. So I wonder if anyone is capable of some kind of clever trick almost that gives an off-ramp enough to both sides, creates some sort of special zone of the controversial territories. It would be the Europeans. I mean, are there not mechanisms that have been used in prior conflicts and prior peace negotiations that kind of fudge the issue, that could be deployed here to give both sides enough reason to claim a partial victory and at least give a year or so of breathing room?
I think not. And I think the fact that nobody's figured out what that clever solution is tells you a lot. But let me come at it from a slightly different perspective. It's very important to understand that both from a Ukrainian point of view and a Russian point of view, the other side represents an existential threat. From the Russian point of view, Ukraine in NATO, Ukraine with serious security guarantees from the West, is an existential threat. And if you're the Russians and you think of what's going on in Ukraine as an existential threat, it is remarkably difficult to compromise in any meaningful way on their major demands that I laid out before. If you go to the Ukrainian side of the equation, for understandable reasons, what the Russians are doing in Ukraine is an existential threat to them. The Russian army has invaded Ukraine. It has formally annexed Crimea and 4 other oblasts. This is an existential threat. So you have 2 countries here who both think they're facing an existential threat from the other. Figuring out a compromise between those 2 sides is difficult in the extreme. Then we go to the Europeans. The Europeans, European leaders, when you listen to them talk, seem to think that the Russians are an existential threat. All sorts of European leaders talk about Russia conquering all of Ukraine, conquering territory in Eastern Europe, and then threatening Western Europe. They make it sound like Russia is the second coming of Nazi Germany, that the Russian army is the equivalent of the Wehrmacht, that Vladimir Putin is the equivalent of Adolf Hitler. There is, in the minds of most European elites, a sense that Russia is an existential threat. And again, when you think that way, it's very hard to compromise.
I've got to interrupt just for a moment, John, because the way you talk about it, it sounds almost like it's an outlandish idea that Europeans have seized onto. But I mean, most of Eastern Europe has living memory of being dominated by the Russians. I mean, the Finns and the Swedes live in kind of daily angst about their proximity to Russia. This is a very real and long, multi-generational fear for them. It's completely understandable that they are anxious to the point of feeling that it's an existential threat, that Russia, which has just invaded one of the Eastern European countries, must not be allowed to get away with it.
Well, Freddie, if you think that way, how are you ever going to get a compromise? That's my point to you. I understand what you're saying, right? I differ on how serious the Russian threat is, but let's just put that aside. The fact is that my view is the minority view. to state it mildly, in Europe and even in the United States. The vast majority of people in Europe and in the United States agree with you. But if they agree with you and people like you are in charge, please explain to me how you reach a compromise.
One of these people that you're referring to is a writer and commentator called Matthew Syed, who wrote in the Sunday Times this past weekend about what he feels have been unacceptable, almost collusion by Europeans with the Russians. And he actually name checks you. I just wanted to read it out and see what your response was. Many geopolitical analysts, I think particularly of John Mearsheimer of the University of Chicago, have convinced themselves that Putin is animated by legitimate fears about the expansion of NATO, that he is, quote, safeguarding the national interest with this war. It would be funny were it not so tragic. ... As for Putin's supposed concerns about national security, give me a break, so writes Matthew Syed. The invasion of Ukraine had nothing to do with security and everything to do with his fear that a successful democracy on the Russian border would undermine his legitimacy. That, I suggest, is why his strategy is so brutal. He is seeking to destroy the will of Ukrainians with the kidnapping of children, the mass rape of women, and the torture of prisoners, and so on. So that, I think, gives you a flavor of what quite a lot of elite and commentariat opinion, and probably opinion within the political establishment as well, is across Europe. How do you respond to that? What would you say to Matthew?
Look, I think the evidence to support his position about Russian thinking that led to the invasion is simply wrong. And I believe there's no evidence to support it. I believe there is overwhelming evidence that this is about NATO expansion into Ukraine. And I've been arguing this for a long time, as you know. I agree with you that most people, the overwhelming majority of people in Europe, agree with Matthew. I don't dispute that. I have not won this debate in the sense that I have convinced more people that I am right over time. Nevertheless, I do believe I'm correct. And if we wanted to argue this out in a series of articles, I believe I would carry the day. But that's largely irrelevant because the fact is his viewpoint dominates in Europe. But again, as I said to you, Freddie, this means, number one, that you're not going to solve this war anytime soon. You're not going to get a meaningful peace agreement. You're not going to get a ceasefire. It's going to be settled on the battlefield. And furthermore, I believe that this means that relations between Russia on one side and Ukraine and Europe on the other side are going to be poisonous for as far as the eye can see. And this is going to have, I believe, hugely negative consequences for Europe. I think that the April 2008 decision to bring Ukraine into NATO was a catastrophic decision. And we have not seen the end of all the damage that's going to come from that decision.
You are part of a school of foreign policy called realism. What is the realistic possibility for Europe to prevail? I mean, is there a path, do you think? If they had sufficient willpower, if they had sufficient commitment, if they was prepared to, if the Matthew Syeds and the political elites of Europe had their way and could back it with the hard power necessary, is there any way for them to actually bring Russia to a weak position where it needs to do a deal and starts accepting concessions? And they start to get something that looks more like the kind of deal they would accept, i.e. more like a victory for Ukraine?
I don't think that the West, and especially the Europeans, have the tools to bring the Russians to their knees. You'd have to bring the Russians to their knees, both economically and militarily. You'd have to put sanctions on them that hurt much more than the sanctions that have been put on them so far have hurt. And furthermore, you'd have to inflict significant defeats on the Russian forces on the battlefield. And I don't think the Europeans or the West more generally have the wherewithal to do that. I think it's quite clear that's the case. But let's assume that they did. Let's assume I'm wrong and that the Europeans and the Americans redouble their efforts, and it begins to have a serious effect on the Russians. You want to remember, Freddie, number one, you're dealing with a country that views what's going on in Ukraine as an existential threat. And number two, you're dealing with a country that has nuclear weapons. And my studying of international relations over time tells me that when great powers feel threatened, when they think their survival or their security is at risk, you do not want to underestimate the steps that they'll take to rescue the situation. So I think even if that situation was possible, and I don't think it's possible, the situation you described, it could lead to nuclear war.
So your message would be careful what you wish for.
Again, you're dealing with a country that views this as an existential threat. You want to go back and think about the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? You want to think about how the United States acted when the Soviet Union put missiles in Cuba, right? This was categorically unacceptable to the United States. The idea that a foreign great power would move into America's backyard and put missiles in Cuba is just unacceptable. We were willing to go to war over that. We had all sorts of plans to invade Cuba, to bomb Cuba. Just unacceptable. And then later, when the Soviets talked about building a naval base at Cienfuegos, we told them in no uncertain terms, that's not going to happen. You're dealing with an analogous situation here. The Russians say it is categorically unacceptable that Ukraine will be in NATO. The idea of NATO stationing military forces in Ukraine, putting missiles in Ukraine, is just unacceptable to the Russians.
It's not quite analogous, though, because Poland, for example, has been in NATO for a while, and it is also a country that borders Russia. There was no other Cuba that already had Russian weapons next to the United States. So the principle is already, it's already established for the Russians.
Ukraine is different. They've made that clear. Poland was shoved down their throat in 1999 when they were very weak and couldn't do anything about it. In fact, another example of the Baltic states, which were shoved down their throat in 2004. Those are the first two tranches of NATO expansion. 1999, that's when Poland came in. 2004, that's when the Baltic states came in. Then the decision was made in April 2008 that Ukraine and Georgia would be brought into NATO. The Russians said that's not happening. In August 2008, you'll remember there was a war over Georgia. Georgia did not become a part of NATO, and the Russians won that war. We now have a war over Ukraine, and the Russians have made it unequivocally clear, time after time, that Ukraine is not going to be part of NATO. And again, when you're dealing with a nuclear-armed country and you present it with an existential threat, you better be very, very careful.
Before I let you go, Professor, I feel like we've painted a lot of bleak scenarios over the last half hour. In fact, pretty much only bleak scenarios. What is, do you think, the best case scenario? What would you like to see happen to minimize bloodshed and to maximize security in the region?
Well, because I believe that Ukraine is going to lose on the battlefield, I believe it's in Ukraine's interest to cut a deal now and basically accept the three major Russian demands. Accept the fact that those 4 oblasts have been lost and that Crimea has been lost. And cut a deal now so you don't lose any more territory. I still believe, Freddie, there's a serious chance that they will lose more territory, that they will lose oblasts like Odessa and Kharkiv and a handful of others. And from a Ukrainian point of view, I think that would be a disaster. So I would cut my territorial losses by agreeing to Russia's territorial demands. And I would also accept the fact that Ukraine has to be a neutral state. You can't be in NATO, and you can't have serious security guarantees from the West. And then I'd accept the fact that Ukraine has to build military forces that don't present a serious threat to Russia, that there's no real offensive capability inherent in Ukraine's military.
Is it not then just this wide open sitting duck? I mean, if it's sitting there saying, okay, you can have these 4 oblasts for free now, we're now going to wind down our army, and we're not going to have any external security guarantees, why would Russia not just carry on hoovering up more oblasts in a year's time?
Well, first of all, they would be a sitting duck. I wouldn't use exactly that terminology, but I think you're basically right. they would be vulnerable to a Russian attack. There's no question about that. They wouldn't have a security guarantee from the West. Their military capability would be limited. You're absolutely right.
It doesn't sound great for Ukraine.
Yes, but the question you have to ask yourself, Freddie, is what is the alternative? I want you to tell me what the alternative is. What's the alternative? I want to be clear here. Am I talking about a good outcome for Ukraine? Absolutely not. I am not talking about a good outcome. I am talking about the least bad outcome. If you don't shut this one down, Ukraine is going to lose more territory. And furthermore, more Ukrainians are going to die. This is a country that, and this is language that you see in the press, Ukraine is in a demographic death spiral. And you're talking about continuing this war, more Ukrainians dying, losing more territory. The only way you can get around that argument is to say that Ukraine is about to reverse the situation on the battlefield. And in fact, Ukraine is going to stem the tide and it's going to roll back the Russians. There's nobody making that argument. There's nobody making the argument that Ukraine can solve the infantry problem. And if you can't solve the infantry problem, how do you improve the situation on the battlefield? And the answer is you don't. And that means more Ukrainians die and you lose more territory. Cut a deal now. But again, nobody's going to accept that logic. Most people completely disagree with most Europeans, for sure, completely disagree with what I have to say. They think that what we should do at this point in time is double down. And as I say, okay, tell me how you double down and you have a happy ending here. I can't tell that story. Doubling down, from my point of view, only leads to more disaster for Ukraine.
Well, we are going to have one such European on the show in the form of Matthew, and I will ask him exactly that question. We'll find out what he has to say. Professor Mearsheimer, thank you so much for joining us once again here at UnHerd.
My pleasure, Freddie. I greatly appreciate you having me on the show.
We're joined now to understand what I'm calling the idealistic position, as opposed to the realist position of John Mearsheimer, by Matthew Syed. He is a writer and a thinker, a columnist for the Sunday Times, and it's his first time on the show. Welcome to UnHerd.
Freddie, great to connect.
So we've just had John Mearsheimer on the show literally moments ago, and I quoted to him some of your most recent Sunday Times column in which you name check him and describe him as morally deranged, which is pretty strong stuff. And I wonder, first up, why do you think Professor Mearsheimer and others who, like him, have, let's call it, a more sympathetic understanding of Russia's reasons for aggression in Ukraine, why are they morally deranged?
Well, I think Mearsheimer and others like him are perpetrating, if I can put it this way, a category mistake. They say that Russia is fearful of NATO expansion to the borders of that country, and they frame that through the war in Ukraine. The biggest threat to the Russian national interest is not democracy, it's not the expansion of NATO, and it is not Ukraine. It is Putin and the network of kleptocrats who support him, who have impoverished the Russian people. The GDP per capita in a mineral-rich country is something like $13,000 a year. They could be rich, they could be flourishing. And I think Mearsheimer is effectively parroting Kremlin talking points by framing it in the way that he has. So I want to see a different framing of the argument that the Russian people, like the Ukrainians, are victims of this war. I think he's making a grievous mistake, if I may put it that way, in his analysis.
So the part which is most controversial there is the history. It's the reason, the rationale for how we got here so far. And I think in a way that's a debate for another day. People talk about the 2008 summit at which the pathway for Ukraine to join NATO was agreed. They talk about the 2014 and the circumstances around that. I would almost like to put that to one side for this conversation. The bit that I find much harder to argue with from John Mearsheimer is his very pessimistic sense of what the West can actually do at this point. He doesn't believe a peace deal that will be acceptable to both is possible. So he believes all of these summits and supposed diplomatic efforts are basically window dressing. And he believes fundamentally the advantage is Russia's to continue to make territorial gains. And so I guess I have to throw it back to you. Do you have any cause for a more optimistic assessment of where the West stands?
Well, I'll just invite anyone listening to this to consider the relative strength of the Western NATO alliance. And we'll start by comparing it with Russia. It's true to say that Russia is itself part of a cohesive axis along with China, Iran, and North Korea. But the collective GDP of the West, the collective military spending, the collective population far outweighs that of Russia. It is a question of will. And my view is if after the invasion we had equipped Ukraine with what they needed to win, that's military equipment and aid, but also more robust sanctions that had been meaningfully enforced, that would have signaled to Putin, and I repeat, he is a kleptocrat who is impoverishing his own people and hates democracy because it would undermine his capacity to continue to loot money in one of the most corrupt nations on earth. Have you noticed, Freddie, how often we hear about Ukrainian corruption? And sadly, there is corruption in Ukraine, but it scores far more impressively, in a good way, on the Transparency International Index than Russia, which is down very near the bottom because Putin siphons off billion. I mean, he's worth probably 200 billion. The West can beat this crippled economy, even though its people are indoctrinated to thinking that this is a patriotic war, when it's exactly the opposite. They are expending their blood, thousands of young Russian men and women brainwashed for what they think is a noble cause, where they're cementing in power a tyrant who is impoverishing them. But with will, I have no doubt the West could get to a position where they were winning, as they were in late 2022, even without the military capability that Ukraine were wishing for. And that would put Russia in a, if I may put it, not Russia, but Putin in a weaker position when it comes to the negotiation. That is, I think, what has been missing from the Western response. And I think the explanation for that has been, again, a fundamental strategic misunderstanding, which was whenever Putin looked like he was losing, he would threaten nuclear war. So the Biden administration said, what we will do is we will give Ukraine what it needs not to lose, but we will never give it enough to look like it might win. The analysis was that would mean that it wouldn't lead to nuclear escalation. But of course, to the extent, this is where Mearsheimer is wrong again, to the extent that Russia feels that it has won, it will seek to bank what it has and take more. Moreover, it will send a signal to other tyrants, I've mentioned China already, which has its eyes on Taiwan, but there are others too, that they can take what they wish to take without meaningful consequence. In other words, escalation is more likely when you show weakness. So I think it's, if I can put it this way, it's flawed at two independent levels, and I just do not understand how they sustain what is, I think, quite clearly a flawed argument.
What I find tough is that very often when talking to particularly European commentariat, politicians, people who are making that argument, there is a kind of intermingling of moral high ground arguments, which are totally fair enough. Putin, not a good guy, kleptocrat, corrupt, has impoverished his nation. I don't think even John Mearsheimer would disagree with that, especially. Also, that we don't want to be sending the signal that you can cross borders and invade countries and be rewarded by territorial gains. That is bad. I think, again, even people who are really ultra so-called realists would sign up to that not being an ideal scenario. But take those things to one side and only focus on the practical, what we can actually do at this point. And I think things start looking a lot bleaker, don't they? Because you could say,
Freddie?
Could say the West has displayed remarkable unity and commitment to the Ukrainian cause. I mean, those sanctions were the largest, most cohesive ever attempted against a single nation like that. I remember Joe Biden saying it was going to cripple the Russian economy. The remarkable thing about the sanctions regime is how unsuccessful it's been. and how new friends have appeared around the world who are prepared to support the Russian economy, and how, as a war economy, it's sort of succeeding. Do you not think the opposite is actually true?
You don't need to bring any. You're right that there's a very strong moral argument in favor of the West over Putin, but you don't need to bring morality in at all. All the strategic insights that I offered in the last answer the points that you made, because you're right that the sanctions were described as robust and unprecedented, but all of the scholarly research shows that they were porous and permitted laundered Russian oil to reach Western markets in huge volumes. And moreover, research by Ed Conway and others have shown that British components have found their ways into Russian munitions. So they have been completely unsuccessful. But it's not just the sanctions that were significant. We could have imposed secondary sanctions, and we could have provided Ukraine with more military equipment of the kind that it was asking for. But remember, the calibration of the equipment given to Ukraine followed the strategic logic that Biden effectively set out, which is we don't want them to win because we fear escalation. There's nothing. I'm not smuggling in ethical considerations to you, Freddie, when I say that escalation is more likely when tyrants and bullies scent weakness. Putin is a realist. Mearsheimer describes him as such. Why would Putin not recognize that if the Western will is robust and it has a GDP unimaginably bigger than that of Russia, a military capability far bigger than that of Russia, even EU GDP is miles bigger than that of Russia. What he thinks he's gambling on is a lack of will. And that lack of will is amplified by people like Mearsheimer, whose lukewarm arguments, I think, have got tremendous coverage in the Western world, much to our disadvantage.
But so what does that will actually look like? Because ultimately it looks like boots on the ground, doesn't it? And if you're asking for that, then you have to go to Western populations and say, do you want to put boots on the ground? And most of them, I suspect, would come back with a resounding no. So yeah, maybe it does come down to will, and maybe the will isn't ultimately there for that.
Well, this I think is a fair point. That if you look at the recent history, particularly of non-American NATO countries, we have shown in what we have done to prioritize the growth of welfare states over the defense expenditure that would have been the best way to deter Putin and others. And that serial free riding, I think particularly of EU countries, was part of the context for the rise of Trump. And I agree completely with him and his administration, where they have tried to shock, if you like, Europe out of its complacency. Trump said Putin can do what the hell he likes to any country not spending 2% of GDP on defense. It made no difference. It didn't make any difference. It took Vance's speech in Europe and the humiliation of Zelensky in the White House and a whole lot of other things before Europe started to step up, at least in terms of words, 3.5% plus an extra percentage and a half of spending on GDP over time. I am still doubtful that the European nations will get to this.
It doesn't answer what they will do this year, next year, because those spending commitments may or may not come into effect over the next 10 years. That's my question to you. What do you want to see happen? Because I think a lot of really good people who fundamentally agree with the moral arguments and the strategic arguments, the importance of quote-unquote defeating Russia and Ukraine, they'd love to see that happen. But what is it you would actually like to see happen? A massive upscaling of defense investment in Ukraine and then more troops? I mean, how are they going to push them out of those heavily now fortified, mined front lines and start to push them out of eastern Ukrainian provinces?
The good news for the West was that we wouldn't have needed troops. The Ukrainian will after the invasion was far higher than Putin calculated. And I think that he could have been pushed back, as he was being pushed back, with armaments and sanctions alone. Now, what I'm seeking to argue is that we have two options. Either we show strength now and deter Putin in the future, because otherwise I think he will be back for more of Ukraine. He has broken all previous agreements with them, and potentially the Baltics and I guess less likely but still possible Poland. There's no doubt that Xi Jinping wishes to invade Taiwan of great strategic significance due to its role in the production of advanced semiconductors. But if we don't deter now and we go down the realist road of saying, yeah, okay, let's dismember Ukraine, carve it up. It won't be a sovereign nation effectively. It will never be able to secure inward investment with that threat hanging over it. Be more like South Vietnam than South Korea in that context. But then we send a green light to all other tyrants. And then we will be fighting in different theatres around the world, and the drumbeat towards the Third World War will become much more intense. The realistic way to do this, Freddie, is to act now. And I wish we had been investing. As somebody with an interest in psychology, I've been arguing for 2 decades that the free riding on America would come back to bite Europe. It was a strategically incoherent Ponzi scheme where we cultivated dependence on Russian natural gas, whilst free riding on our protector, leading to massive and growing resentment, which means that we are now in a very precarious position. What's fascinated me in cultural terms is how difficult it's been, even now, for somebody like Starmer to increase defence spending by cutting back on welfare commitments with backbench revolts and all the rest of it. And so, it's possible that the West is in a stage of civilizational decline and we're just not capable of mustering the will. But the alternative is not that we freeze the conflict in Ukraine and everything goes back to the wonderful time we had between 1990 and, 2014 or 2022. We go to a more disruptive world where the autocratic axis becomes more cohesive and it thinks it can exert more power, both in the Pacific and in Europe and in Africa, where the Belt and Road Initiative is already paying dividends.
So just to be clear, you think it is a practical possibility that we should be pursuing at full speed to actually push Russian troops out of all of the 4 eastern provinces of Ukraine that they are in, plus Crimea, ? Is that on the table for you? That should be the goal, and anything short of that is a principled defeat?
No, not quite. I wish we hadn't started at this point. I wish we had not appeased Putin over Crimea, and I wish we had invested in defence. We would be in a much better position. But we are where we are. My strategic lens after the invasion was that the benefits that Putin accrues from, as it were, stealing land from a sovereign nation must be outweighed by the cost that is imposed upon him and the Russian elites. So I would be looking for if I was Prime Minister of the UK or President of the United States, my advisors to give me a very clear readout of any gain negotiated by Putin in a discussion that freezes a conflict and leads to an armistice or peace treaty, but to make absolutely sure that the cost, if you like, is higher.
What you hear a lot is a comparison to World War II. That's true of almost any political argument, as you have observed, but particularly in the context of the invasion of Ukraine. And the feeling is that some sort of Churchillian mood should prevail, which is that we will accept nothing. We will fight them on the beaches. We must not repeat Munich. We must not appease the aggressor. And we must be the heroes who, contrary to all the practical evidence, just carry on fighting and eventually victory will be ours. That's the sort of mood you quite often hear, particularly in Europe. And I just wonder whether Afghanistan and Iraq might be a more salient comparator. And there you see objectives which weren't ever really achievable, just pursued for years after years, decades, with huge costs to the West. And, is there not a chance that a big heroic sounding ideal like evicting Russia from all 4 provinces and reconquering Crimea sounds great and Churchillian and inspiring, but actually it's more like Iraq and Afghanistan. It's sending us in an already weak position down an impossible path.
I'm glad you've brought up Afghanistan and Iraq, because if I could give a slightly longer answer than usual, the biggest flaw, in my view, in Western geopolitical analysis is a failure to understand the psychology particularly the cultural psychology of the nations that we invade or that we oppose or even that we work together with. One of the most important findings in social science of the last century, perhaps ever, is that the idea that human psychology is uniform around the world, effectively, implicitly, in Daniel Kahneman's work, Thinking Fast and Slow, that we have certain biases and heuristics that we share because of the evolved architecture of the human mind. Listeners might know about loss aversion or the disposition effect or the fundamental attribution error. It's almost like a butterfly collector's list of different quirks of the human mind that we putatively all share. It's just not true. Human psychology systematically varies around the world. So there's a distribution, and guess who anchors the tail of the distribution? The most odd psychology is the West. We're more individualistic, more morally universalistic. You kind of alluded to that, Freddie, a bit earlier. We fundamentally misunderstood Iraqi cultural psychology and Afghan cultural psychology with those absurd conflicts. We thought, you can see this from the evidence, that we would invade Iraq and, somewhat like Japan and Germany after the Second World War, would introduce democracy and it would become a Jeffersonian liberal state. But of course, in tribal countries of the kind that Iraq and Afghanistan are, those tribes that get hold of the levers of power loot, if you like, the state to share with their tribal proxies. The moral psychology is really tribal. You have all these different tribal verticals and you think of it in those terms. Could talk much more about that. Very interestingly, Russian psychology is very different to the Western world. It's a very significant outlier in some key respects. And I think Mearsheimer misses this. It goes back to the very interesting history of Russia. In the early modern period, where feudalism was being dismantled in Western Europe, and serfs were being liberated to leave the overlords and to go in the cities with very rapid urbanization. This is the time when Russia, which of course had been under the Mongol yoke for at least 2 centuries, which was a very punitive imperial system, the nobility in Russia started to oppress the Russian serfs. And they couldn't escape. They were tied to the land. And some of these aristocrats had, thousands of slaves, effectively. It was very punitive all the way up through to the 19th century. And then, of course, you had the Bolsheviks, which were like repressive aristocracy wearing the clothing of Marxist ideology. And then after the end of communism, the collapse of the Soviet Empire, you have the rise of Putin and the kleptocrats, which is really Ivan the Terrible in the new guise. When you have a millennia of a group of people who have been oppressed and punished, you end up with what I think is a collective form of Stockholm syndrome, where in order to survive, the population, like victims of kidnapping, start to identify with their oppressors. It's the only way to survive. And this is why Russia is so high on what's called the Hofstede Power Index, where they're very deferential to authority. This is what's so tragic for me about Russia today, is that many people think they demonstrate patriotism by identifying with Putin when he is the person who is effectively impoverishing and terrorizing them. And I think it is a total disaster for academics like Mearsheimer to buy this risible argument that Putin's worried about a democracy in Ukraine because he's worried about the Russian national interest. He doesn't give a stuff about the Russian national interest. He's the biggest opponent for crying out loud, of the Russian national interest. He's taken 200 billion for these people. They're still siphoning off billions every year from the taxpayers. Please, I say to listeners, don't buy this realist. It's not realist. It's a complete fantasy that's being perpetrated. And yes, I agree with you about. Look, forgive a very long answer. I agree with a lot of what you said about Ukraine and Afghanistan, but this, let me tell you, is a winnable, or at least a war in Ukraine where we can secure a sovereign Ukraine, I think, with a viable future, and therefore send a message to these terrible dictators like Putin.
If the Russian national character is, as you say, and has been so for centuries, if not millennia, part of that may be a much higher pain threshold, as it were, much higher ability to endure casualties in the family, economic impoverishment in pursuit of what they're told is a good goal, or where they don't even care to question it too much. It's not realistic that that's going to change. So I would say what you've just said is very convincing, but increases the sense that they are going to be in it for the long haul in a way that it's very hard for Europe to be. There is economic pressures, political pressures, internal constituents, etc. Can we really outlast and outgun them for many years to come?
If our economics were comparable, I don't think we would. What you said, I think, is right. One of the great wonders of history is that the West, I don't know if Mearsheimer would agree with this, the West, by including more people in the prosperity of the nation state, by having inclusive institutions, by having a robust rule of law, by constraining the arbitrary confiscation of property by elites. These are morally wonderful things, but they are also massively advantageous economically. The history of humanity is one where for 240,000 years there was no economic growth. It was with liberty and freedom and property rights and growing social trust, which is another thing that is emergent from, in a complicated way, from Western individualist psychology. You got economic growth and prosperity. And this is why, while you're right to say that our will to die is probably less than that of the Russian people, we have economies that are far more dynamical than theirs. And that is a massive strategic asset that we mustn't underestimate. But, and I throw this caveat in, certainly over the last 50 years, we've become a bit decadent. And you can see this kind of as a proxy with the level of public debt, which has just kept going up. We keep running deficits. We want to spend more than we're earning. That was not how the West was built. Between 1670 and 1970, the British state didn't run a fiscal deficit outside a major war. We had a deep fidelity to the future. We knew that if we ran deficits, it would be the next generation that paid, and we didn't want to do that, if that makes sense. Since 1970, France has run deficits every year, 50 in a row. The UK every year bar about 3. The debt to GDP ratio at a time of peace has gone in the US from about 35% to 120%. The UK, it's over 100%. France is high and rising. So the interest payments on the debt are now a very significant part of the state budget. What I'm trying to say to people is we are the beneficiaries of an extraordinary cultural inheritance. And we mustn't fritter it away with ever more deficits and QE and all the other ill discipline that we've seen over the course of the second half of my life. We have to value what we've had. And that also means standing up to those who wish to destroy it, because Putin and Xi Jinping, they don't just wish to destroy it in Ukraine and in Taiwan. They want to reset the world order. And that's what I fear. We are in a battle for the future of the West. And voices like Mearsheimer's, I'm sorry to say, are not ones that are conducive to the will that I want to see re-injected, not in the Churchillian way, but in a strategically rational way to protect what we have.
I think you'll be getting standing ovations from many of our listeners for much of that. You're talking really about liberalism and all of its achievements and how we don't want to step back from it and kowtow to people who would destroy it. The fundamental choice, I think, facing us is it plausible to win in Ukraine? Because if it's not, then it suddenly becomes evil and detrimental to the flourishing of our liberal societies to try and pursue it, even though it's not possible.
You
If we are beset by so many challenges. We've got America, we've got economic crises, we've got energy crisis, technology, restive populations and the rest of it. We can't do everything because we are weak. So sadly, we have to make choices. Is that not the reality? And maybe an imperfect resolution to Ukraine is one of the compromises we have to get in order to divert our resources to rescuing our culture.
Well, I don't have a problem with an imperfect settlement. But as I say, the imperfect settlement has to exert a cost greater than any benefits that Putin materializes for him. But Freddie, you keep coming back to this. Is it realistic? I ask anyone just to Google Russian GDP and then Google NATO and then look at the military spending and then look at population size and any other realistic appraisal of the comparison between these two entities. Where we really suffer, Freddie, is in manufacturing capability. That would become quite a significant factor in any hot war, and I do worry about that. But I think a lot of it's going to be determined in quantum computing, LLMs, artificial intelligence, drone production, cybersecurity and attack. I think we need to be serious about all those things. But you say, how can we do it? Imagine you're Putin, Freddie. So you've got a 200 billion fortune. You have a young girlfriend, you have a Black Sea palace, and you have a group of 500 to 1,000 kleptocrats who are continuing to siphon off money from the Russian people. You know that if you lose power, you'll be killed. And most of the kleptocrats probably along with you. Whether Russia could shift its long-term historical trajectory and actually start moving towards democracy, okay, this is a debatable point. But then imagine that your adversaries start to demonstrate a bit of will. And the hundreds of thousands of young men and women that you've lost start to escalate because suddenly Ukraine have more weapons. And you start to threaten nuclear war, which is mutually assured destruction. And the people around you are like, well, hang on a second. If you actually do go to that stage and they're not believing any of this crap anymore, we're going to get incinerated. I want you just to imagine the nervousness of Putin as he looks at his bodyguards and he looks at the others thinking, my goodness, this president's made a terrible mistake. The West's will is stronger than we thought. Who's more vulnerable, Freddie? Keir Starmer, Donald Trump, sitting on these hugely robust institutional norms that have been there for generations, or Putin, who's held in power by an informal network of cronies who he is enriching. Far more vulnerable. Don't buy this nonsense from the realists that Putin is in a position of strength. He's only in a position of strength because we buy this nonsense. Why Biden did, I have no idea. He compared to you, me, and virtually anyone else living in the UK, he is vulnerable. Look what happened to Gaddafi when Gaddafi fell. Look what happened to Saddam Hussein. Do you not think that Putin goes to bed utterly paranoid that might happen to him? He has already, in my view, sought out the potential exit route that he can go and live out his final days if the West wakes up. Let me put it that way. That's not something that Western leaders need to worry about. And by the way, anywhere he goes, if they decide to join up to the International Criminal Court, and we can pressure them to do so, we should say this, he'll end up in The Hague.
Sounds risky, though, to a lot of people, I think. You know, you're relying on his henchmen to depose him in a nuclear scenario. I'm not sure that most people would want to put the possibility of nuclear war in the hands of some kleptocrats around Putin to successfully depose him. And the idea that if he were to actually go, you have any confidence that whoever replaces him would be better is also a bit of a gamble. You know, at least he has some training in, you know, the norms of previous decades. He was a Soviet character. He does appear to be reluctant to go to nuclear war. Who knows, some wacko 28-year-old ultra-nationalist could become president and then would be even more in danger.
I accept. Both those points are very fair points. I let my rhetorical flourishing carry me away a little. I think everything I said was true. So let's just deal with those 2 points in turn. Can we rely on people to stop Putin escalating to nuclear war? Well, the question is, where does the risk of escalation come from? Is it an early show of strength? Or is it trying to show strength later on, which is where we are now after Crimea, Freddie? Is what they said during Crimea. I think it's higher now. I think an earlier signal of strength would have made escalation less likely. So on that point, I hear what you're saying, but I disagree. But you are right that it's possible an ultranationalist would take over. I think it's less likely that somebody would come to power thinking that they could convince the oligarchs, the kleptocrats, that they are going to serve their interests by saber-rattling more against the Western world. Given if we were to show the will to Putin, I don't think it would be a plausible analysis for them. I think what they would do there is obviously the oligarchs would be seeking very, very hard to find exit routes for their money. The reason they brought, why do you think the oligarchs brought it all to London? Partly they wanted to live here with the nice restaurants, but they just thought the rule of law would protect their property. It was all stolen and looted from the Russian people. This is why I had such a big problem with Abramovich and Chelsea, is because we were allowing them to launder their money here, if that makes sense. We were inciting them to continue to loot the Russian people, knowing that it could be recycled in Mayfair and Knightsbridge and football clubs. I didn't want these people to have that legitimacy, but I accept your point about an ultra-nationalist leader coming in. We have to be deeply aware of that risk.
Final question for you, Matthew. So we've talked about what you'd like to see happen, which what I'm taking to your answer to be is stepping up resistance in whatever ways we can, harder sanctions, more military support to Ukraine, and just try to win a war of attrition over time. Is that a fair summary of what you'd like to see happen?
With a few caveats. And
what do you think will happen?
Well, that's very difficult. You will know, Freddie, how difficult. I mean, what is it? What's the old saying? Prediction is very difficult, particularly about the future. I don't know. I don't know what Trump's analysis fundamentally is of the world. Mine is perhaps a little simpler. I believe that the West has conferred extraordinary benefits on remarkable numbers of people, and that we, as the custodians of that inheritance, have a massive responsibility to preserve that for future generations. It's particularly important in the age of AI, where even more power will be handed to states. So I think we have to see it through that lens. Does Trump see it in those terms? I'm not sure that he does. I worry a lot about the tariffs. Where I think Trump was absolutely right is to try and get Europe to step up on defense spending. I mean, the cumulative underspend, even if you just look since 2014, is about $1 trillion. I mean, it really is awful, reprehensible, what we sought to get away with. But Freddie, let me ask you a question in closing, because I'm not sure if I've convinced you. Look, you're a journalist as well as an interviewer, so I want to put you on the spot. You listen to Mearsheimer, and you've listened to me. I want to have a chance to challenge you if you agreed with Mearsheimer, because I've got a second. Mearsheimer could have done this if he had got a second. But if you disagree with me, I want to know where and how. And if you agree with me, given that the listeners respect you, I'd love to hear that too.
I agree with you 100% about our inheritance and the importance of those freedoms, and people who want to chip away at them should be resisted, internally or externally. So that much I'm giving 2 big thumbs up to. It's when we get really practical about exactly what measures we're supposed to be taking that I get more skeptical, because I feel like the Russian army is now very deeply embedded in the whole swathe of eastern Ukraine. The Crimea is the biggest single military installation in the whole of the Russian Federation. The idea, which is still bandied around on BBC TV programs, that we're going to evict them from Crimea, which you hear MPs say all the time, it does feel like it's for the birds. So I think a dose of reality is prudent. Where I think Mearsheimer sounds most convincing is that we don't have that many levers left. Let's take your example of harsher sanctions. Donald Trump's talked about it. He's threatened India. But will we actually see it? Probably not, because the economic cost of suddenly sanctioning 10 more large economies is not one that Donald Trump wants to undertake, and probably not one that the Europeans can afford. So we are boxed in in our relative weakness. And so I think at some point...
And what about Putin's weakness?
Putin, because of the kind of cultural and psychological history that you talked so eloquently about, has a greater bandwidth to behave in a responsible way and get away with it. You know, he also has a massive landmass which contains all of the primary resources that he needs. And so he is much closer to a kind of autarkic war economy than Europe, for example. So although GDP-wise we look like, you know, the giant, in terms of being able to grimly sustain his effort for a long time, he has advantages. And I do feel worried about allowing it to go on and on for years just to make us feel good about ourselves.
Well, we definitely shouldn't do that. We definitely shouldn't allow it just to drag on in the way that Biden, I think, planned for. But on the realism, I agree. I'm not sure I would fight for. I think Crimea's gone. I think there is a balance between the recognition that there is a strong strategic benefit from pushing Putin out of the whole of sovereign Ukraine and coming up with an imperfect deal that really has some teeth, in the sense that it shows Putin that there was a will behind it, and not to allow the dismemberment without that being absolutely clear. So perhaps we could agree on that.
Let's call that common ground, Matthew. Once again, thank you so much for coming on, and hope to have you again once we find out what's happened in the next few weeks and months. We can discuss it then.
Thanks, Freddie.
Our thanks there both to John Mearsheimer and Matthew Syed. Towards the end there, he turned the tables on me and asked me what I thought, and I was pretty honest. I just said that I think Mearsheimer gets some things right, and I think he gets some things right. How we square those things is, of course, the big question. So we're going to be following with great interest what happens in coming weeks. If you've lasted this long for this special extra long episode of UnHerd, thanks to you for wanting to hear different perspectives. And as always, let us know what you think in the comments, whether you are watching on YouTube or listening on the podcast. This was UnHerd.